My first day in Cyprus, and I come to this. No, I think you are the highest delegation. Yeah, this is what they are. It was pretty Ela, solo de Clergy, Clergy puede hacer cosas porque Severis se me fue en la que van a hacer las cosas. Vorrei parlare del grosso di raccontare quello che ho portato. La possibilità. Solo sono state
How are you? Good evening, everybody. I would like to mention a welcome to His Excellency Archbishop Giovanni Pietro D'Artoso, the Apostolic Nuncio in Cyprus. Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Italy, His Beatitude Pier Battista Pizzaballa, our Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Monsignor George Panamzundil, the Chargé d'Affaires of the Apostolic Nunciature in Cyprus, and Reverend Father Bruno Variano, the Latin Patriarchal Vicar for Cyprus. So we have a very distinguished audience tonight. And of course, all of you who are here with us have made the time to come and listen to this very interesting presentation. And Dr. Coureas, who very kindly agreed to give us this talk this evening. Tonight's lecture is organized as part of my aim of promoting awareness of the Latin Catholic community and the presence of the Catholic Church in Cyprus, its historic development and contribution to Cyprus society and culture overall. I'd like to just say a few words to present Dr. Nicolas Coureas, who I'm sure you probably already know, before he starts his presentation on the Latin community of Cyprus and its historical antecedents, clergy and laity. Dr. Coureas works as a senior researcher at the Cyprus Research Center in Nicosia, where he is specialized on the history of Lusignan Cyprus. Within this field, his special interests are the history of the Latin Church of Cyprus and of Cypriot commerce. He has published various articles and books on this subject, including the monograph The Latin Church in Cyprus 1195-1312 in 1997, and its sequel, The Latin Church of Cyprus 1313-1378, which was published in 2010. Together with Michael Walsh and Peter Edbury, he published the conference Proceedings Medieval and Renaissance Famagusta in 2012. And again with Professor Peter Edbury, he also published a chronicle titled The Chronicle of Amadi, translated from the Italian, in 2015. More recently, he has published a monograph titled The Burgesses of Lusignan Cyprus, 1192 to 1474. This was in 2020. And I'd like to call him to start his presentation. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to all of you for being here. And I would also like to extend a big thank you to the organizers who helped bring this event to fruition, helped it materialize. This evening, as you already heard, I'm going to talk about the Latin community of Cyprus and how it developed during the Ottoman and early British periods. My talk will be divided into two parts. In the first part, I will be talking about the development of the Latin, that is Roman Catholic clergy in Cyprus during the Ottoman and early British periods. And in the second part of the talk, I will be talking about the development of the Latin lay community. So, let us begin. The present Latin community of the island, as regards both its clerical and secular members, came into being during the early Ottoman period, with members of the Franciscan order of the Roman Catholic Church playing a crucial role in the preservation and propagation of the Roman Catholic faith in Cyprus during the difficult years following the Ottoman conquest of 1571. And it began to increase notably in numbers, during the late Ottoman and early British periods. it had a nationally heterogeneous composition. Its members originated from Venice, other areas of Italy, Malta, France, and even Dalmatia. Most of the Latins of the island not belonging to the clergy were engaged in commercial pursuits, but nonetheless also developed notable initiatives in other fields such as agriculture and education, and thereby made a significant contribution to the island's life. This communication will outline the creation and the development of the contemporary Latin community in Cyprus from the beginning of the Ottoman period until today. Given that this community includes members of the clergy as well as laypersons, a description of Latin religious institutions and activities in Cyprus will be given first. It will be followed by the history of the Latins who were or became permanent residents of Cyprus from the Ottoman period onwards. This paper will not concern itself, except fleetingly, with visiting travellers, merchants, sailors, and others visiting the island or staying on a temporary basis. For purposes of definition, it should also be pointed out that the term Latins in this article refers mainly to those inhabitants of Cyprus who were Roman Catholics by confession and European by origin. It does not include Maronites, who are Roman Catholics originating from Lebanon and northern Syria. First, we begin with the Latin clergy after 1571. The Ottoman capture of Cyprus in 1571 resulted in the formal dissolution of the Latin Church of the island, which had been founded as far back as 1196 by a bull of Pope Celestine III and had been the island's established church during the periods of Lusignan and Venetian rule, from 1191 to 1571, that is 380 years. The Roman Catholic clergy continued nonetheless to maintain a presence in Cyprus, albeit an extremely low-key one. A Franciscan convent dedicated to St. Lazarus was founded in Larnaca in 1593, and on buying back the church of St. Lazarus in Larnaca from the Turks in 1589, the Orthodox Christians of Cyprus allowed the Roman Catholic clergy to celebrate the divine offices there on the feast of St. Lazarus and of St. Mary Magdalene. This practice continued until 1784, when, following protests by the island's Orthodox clergy to the Ottoman Sultan, the Latins were forbidden to celebrate church services there. In fact, however, the Roman Catholic clergy used to hold church services there until 1784, even if only twice a year. The fact that they did so constitutes proof of the existence of a Latin clerical and lay population in Larnaca. According to the testimony of the Italian theologian Girolamo Dandini, the Latin community of Cyprus by 1596 also had a small church in Nicosia. Its priest is described as, quote, unlettered but honest, end quote, while Italian merchants, who were in all probability Venetians permanently resident in Nicosia, provided for the sacred objects, sustenance, and clothing of this priest. In the same year, the English traveller F. Morrison visited Cyprus, staying for 3 nights with a companion at the Franciscan residence in Larnaca. Both of them, on departing, gave some money to the Franciscan friars there for their needs. 2 years later, in 1598, the Dutch visitor Johann van Kudwich referred to a Franciscan cemetery in Larnaca adjoining the Church of St. Lazarus, at which European seafarers who had died in the town were buried according to the Roman rite. The Franciscans, who had purchased this cemetery from the Turks a few years previously, and had purchased this cemetery from the Turks a few years previously. The phenomenon of Latin Christians going over to the Muslim faith is also mentioned by Van Kudwich, who imparts the information that the incumbent Ottoman governor of Cyprus jailed a Venetian merchant who had become Muslim and had then returned to Christianity unrepentant, and who had also assisted a German Franciscan who had likewise become Muslim and had subsequently repented and become Christian again to escape from Cyprus. Van Kudwich also gives a description of the Franciscan establishments at Larnaca that were constituent parts of the convent of St. Lazarus, stating that the friars lived in several small rooms with funds offered by the faithful. A wall had been constructed around these establishments by way of protection from the robbers and thieves in the area, and located within this wall was an orchard and a vegetable garden in which the friars cultivated fruit and vegetables. The Franciscan friars also offered hospitality within these establishments to pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land. These pilgrims, along with various merchants, travelers and seafarers, arriving in Cyprus from Western Europe, from time to time donated sums of money to the Franciscans, an order of mendicant friars, to cover their needs. Indeed, the Franciscans were entitled to go on board the ships from Western Europe at anchor in the harbour of Larnaca, so as to ask for alms from the seamen and other travellers who, according to Van Kudwich, gave generously. The Venetian ships frequenting Larnaca, for instance, gave them 1 gold ducat in the course of each visit. We now come to the 17th century. The Franciscan establishment in Larnaca continued to exist into the 17th century and was mentioned in the year 1625 by the Roman noble Della Valle in the course of his visit to Cyprus. Della Valle also visited the monastery of Ayanapa. He observed that this establishment, although orthodox, had an altar at the corner of the church which the visiting Latin clergy could use to administer the sacraments in accordance with their own traditions. The 17th century witnessed an important new development, the re-establishment of Latin secular clergy on the island. The establishment of a Roman Catholic bishopric in Cyprus was undertaken during the early part of the 17th century, while the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, the so-called Propaganda Fidei, a missionary organization, was founded in 1622 under Pope Gregory XV. In 1625, it resolved to send 2 Jesuit missionaries to Cyprus to propagate the Roman Catholic faith, but not to found a bishopric on the island. Indeed, 2 French Jesuits arrived on Cyprus in 1627 in the company of a French merchant, but both were arrested and expelled following reports to the Ottoman authorities that they were spies of the King of Spain. Despite these initial reservations, the congregation, aided by the ardent wish of the Venetian merchants in Cyprus for the creation of a Latin bishopric there, eventually founded a Roman Catholic bishopric in Paphos in 1629 with jurisdiction over the Latin and the Maronite churches of the island. The first incumbent of the see was the Carmelite friar, Peter de Vespis, whose dislike of the Maronites, who had previously objected to the establishment of a Latin bishopric in Paphos, impelled him to campaign forcefully to make the Maronites conform to Latin usages. A report on the ecclesiastical situation in Cyprus, compiled by the able Franciscan missionary Giovanni Battista da Todi in 1647, stated that a Franciscan church dedicated to the Holy Cross had been founded in Nicosia 6 to 8 years previously. Attached to it was a hospice with 4 priests. The Franciscans also maintained a school in Nicosia with 13 pupils. This report alludes to a church of St. James in Nicosia, maintained by the Capuchin friars, and to a Franciscan hospice in Limassol, which needed vestments and sacred objects pertaining to the altar, and where the sacraments were administered in secret. The secret administration of the sacraments indicates that those Roman Catholics not resident in Nicosia, the island's capital, or in Larnaca, the chief port in which the European consul resided, encountered restrictions and difficulties in the free exercise of their faith, given that the Europeans who had some influence over the Ottoman authorities were concentrated either in Nicosia or in Larnaca. In Larnaca, the report mentioned 8 Latins and an undetermined number of Greek Roman Catholics, and a Franciscan church dedicated to St. Mary of the Graces, which still exists today. Giovanni Battista's report also mentions by name a number of Cypriot converts to Roman Catholicism. They were Greeks for the most part, although 2 of the converts in question are specifically described as Christian renegades, that is, Christians who had become Muslim but had then returned and embraced Roman Catholicism. Later, in the 17th century, more Capuchin friars arrived and established houses in Paphos and Larnaca, but they were apparently unable to remain owing to the decline of the communities of merchants that supported them. Roman Catholic missionary activity in Cyprus declined sharply following the death of Giovanni Battista da Todi in 1666. On the death of the Roman Catholic Bishop Leonardo Paoli in 1684, no one was sent to replace him, since the total Latin population of Cyprus now numbered only 250 persons. We now come to the 18th century. The Latin clergy maintained their presence and establishments in Cyprus during this period, notwithstanding the unpromising environment. In the early 18th century, the Franciscan friars in Larnaca encountered other difficulties in addition to the presence of thieves and robbers. Instances of renegades are encountered once again in the century. Two more Franciscan friars, the Spaniard Antonio de Valenzuela and the Portuguese Lázaro Nunes de Souza, came to Cyprus in 1701 and 1705 respectively with the intention of becoming Muslims. But de Souza subsequently repented and suffered death by decapitation for apostatizing from Islam. In 1738, the English visitor R. Pocock stated that the Franciscan friars maintained a large establishment in Larnaca and that the Roman Catholic monks of the Capuchin order also maintained a convent there. Indeed, the Capuchin convent in Larnaca is attested from the beginning of the 18th century, for in 1707 an Ottoman official imposed a heavy fine on this monastery, which, in contravention of Islamic law, had constructed an additional small building to the existing establishment. The Ottoman governor of Cyprus eventually rescinded the fine on obtaining a, quote, present of 200 piastres from the French consulate, a vivid instance of how Latin religious establishments in Cyprus needed the diplomatic and financial support of the European consulates in general, and of the French consulates in particular. The recorded presence of Capuchin friars in Larnaca, however, indicates that either they had returned to Cyprus, or, unlike their brethren in Paphos, the Capuchins in Larnaca had not departed from the island at the end of the 17th century. There are, moreover, testimonies dating from the beginning of the 18th century regarding the Franciscan establishment in Nicosia. 5 to 6 Franciscan friars were resident there, according to the Dutch visitor and professor Johannes Heyman, who visited Cyprus and other lands of the Near East between the years 1700 and 1709. The existence of these two Franciscan establishments in Cyprus, a major one in Larnaca and a smaller one in Nicosia, which Pocock also mentioned, is indeed indicative of the continued presence of the Roman Catholic clergy in Cyprus at the start of the 18th century. Drummond, the British consul in Cyprus, stated that in 1745 both the Franciscans and the Capuchins maintained establishments in Larnaca. The Spanish Franciscan Juan Lopez, who had sojourned for a certain length of time there, provided additional information on the Franciscan establishment in Nicosia. He described it as a cheerful and welcoming edifice with a beautiful garden located near the Paphos Gate. We now come to the 19th century. For the beginning of the 19th century, there exists a testimony of several British visitors to Cyprus. Coureas, the Scottish official of the East India Company who visited Cyprus in 1814, referred to the Franciscan establishment in Nicosia. Captain Henry Light of the Royal Artillery visited the island in the same year and was impressed by the Franciscan house in Larnaca, describing it as being extremely large and impressive, and as the home of the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, which functioned as a seminary for Roman Catholic priests on Cyprus. He advised travellers to stay at these establishments, clearly on account of its having the most suitable facilities for them. The British traveller Turner journeyed to Cyprus in 1815 and likewise visited the Franciscan establishment in Larnaca. He described their church as small but tasteful, imparting the information that the French and Austrian consuls attended its services. When the Greek War of Independence broke out in 1821, its consequences in Cyprus extended to the Latins on the island as well as the Greeks. According to the Roman newspaper Notizia del Giorno, Ottoman soldiers stationed in Nicosia fired upon the Franciscan church in the town during the course of the service, spreading terror among the congregation to the point where a considerable number of ladies fainted. This notwithstanding, the Franciscans continued to maintain a presence in Nicosia. The Franciscan friar Padre Antonio, who was of Venetian origin, conducted the Scotsman Malcolm Lyon Neeson around Nicosia in the course of his visit to the capital in 1853. Lane mentions the Franciscan convent in Nicosia, as well as the fact that their major establishment in Larnaca housed the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, and so was responsible for the training of the Maronite clergy of Cyprus as well as the Latin clergy. As mentioned above, laying was conducted around Nicosia by a Franciscan of Venetian origin during the course of his visit there. But an anonymous author writing in 1878, shortly after the cession of Cyprus by the Ottoman Empire to Britain, states that the friars resident at that time in the Franciscan house in Nicosia originated from Spain. The educational and humanitarian activity of the Roman Catholic clergy in Cyprus during the course of the 19th century is worthy of mention. In 1833, American missionaries on Cyprus founded schools that Greeks also attended, but these were considered as centers of proselytizing, and in 1837, the missionaries were forbidden to found more such schools following the intervention of the Greek Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, with the missionaries themselves eventually leaving Cyprus in 1841. The schools they had founded, however, continued to be maintained and to follow the same system of education introduced by the missionaries, for they had proved the value of a Western education to the Greeks. Shortly after the missionaries' departure, however, the sisters of the Roman Catholic Order of Saint Joseph of the Apparition founded a hospital, a pharmacy, and a new Roman Catholic school for girls in 1844. By the following year, this school had 80 pupils, while the building housing the school had the capacity for no less than 500 pupils. This was because its founders entertained the hope that it would attract students not only from Cyprus, but also from the whole East Mediterranean area. With the passage of time, these hopes proved unfounded, and in 1858, the school had only 20 female students, both Latin and Orthodox. In 1890, a Roman Catholic priest founded schools in various small villages in the district of Limassol that were unable to finance their own schools due to poverty, and he employed a teacher for educating the pupils there. The fact that these schools functioned allegedly as proselytizing centers provoked strong opposition among the Greeks of Limassol, who responded by raising funds themselves to support these schools, and the teacher, whom the priest had persuaded to work there, resigned. We now turn to the second part of the talk, the Latin lay population in Cyprus after 1571. We first look at the 16th and the 17th centuries. Turning to the secular Latin element in Cyprus following its capture in 1571 by the Ottomans, one can see that the Latins still remaining on the island immediately after the conquest were mainly Venetians. The so-called Consul of the Franks, referred to by the French traveller Bervaux in 1604, must have been of Venetian origin, while the same person offers the information that there were also Dutch merchants in Larnaca in the same period. The Roman nobleman de la Valle mentioned Venetian merchants resident in Larnaca, pointing out that the Venetians maintained a consulate in this town there from way back. He further observed that the Venetian consuls in Cyprus were independent and not accountable to their counterparts at Aleppo in Syria. He observes, however, that the latter enjoyed diplomatic precedence on account of their noble origin, for their counterparts in Larnaca were of burgess origin. By the end of the 17th century, however, the French appear to have supplanted the Venetians as the main component of the Latin population in Cyprus. A French explorer by the name of N.D. Hurtrel visited Cyprus in 1670, mentioning a French consul resident in Larnaca for providing services to ships calling there from Marseille, the main Mediterranean French port, and other French ports in the Mediterranean. The Dutch traveller Van Bruyn, who visited Cyprus in the year 1683, stated that virtually all the European merchants resident in Larnaca were French, with very few exceptions. It should be noted here that it was not by any means fortuitous that the majority of the Latins on Cyprus resided in Larnaca, for the consulates established at the port of Larnaca provided both employment and protection for the Latin population, secular as much as clerical, that lived on Cyprus. We now turn to the 18th century. In the 18th century, in other cities of Cyprus, lacking the presence of European consulates, it was far more difficult for Latins to take up residence. The Dutch professor Johannes Heyman visited Cyprus at the beginning of the 18th century, observing that both Latins and Greeks were forbidden to enter the port city of Famagusta on horseback, something that discouraged Latins from settling there and ensured that they continued to be centered in Larnaca. Heyman also alludes to both the British and the Dutch consulates in Larnaca, something that constitutes proof of the establishment of Cyprus by the beginning of the 18th century. The maritime republic of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik in present-day Croatia, situated on the Dalmatian coast, also maintained a diplomatic presence in Cyprus during this period. And in 1738, the English traveller R. Pocock mentioned the consulate of Ragusa in Larnaca. One notes that at the beginning of the 18th century, the consul of Ragusa in Larnaca was subject to his counterpart in Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The enterprising Ivan Garmolietsi, who was consul at Larnaca from 1713 onwards, was eventually appointed to this position for life, holding it until his death in 1759, and he had by then become a fabulously wealthy merchant and shipowner. The Ragusan consulate in Cyprus continued to play an active part in the island's commerce until 1808, when the French Emperor Napoleon abolished the Republic of Ragusa. At the close of the 18th century, a Ragusan sea captain named Antonio Roretti bought a large expanse of land to the west of Kyrenia and created the well-known estate there known as Sunji. The Venetians, who were the first to found the consulate in Ottoman Cyprus, continued to maintain a presence on the island down to the end of the 18th century, when Napoleon conquered Italy and abolished the Venetian Republic. The Swedish doctor Frederick Hasselquist, who visited Cyprus in 1751, stayed in Larnaca at the house of the Venetian consul, who at that time also represented Sweden. An anonymous English officer of the East India Company, who visited Cyprus in 1779, mentioned a French merchant staying in Larnaca as well as the Venetian consul, informing us that the house of the Venetian consul was not within the town of Larnaca, but 10 miles distant from it. Monsieur de Vezin, the British consul in Cyprus in 1792, who was of French origin, likewise referred to the Venetian consulate at Larnaca and to the export of various Cypriot products to France, Venice, and Tuscany. We now turn to the 19th and 20th centuries. With the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 and Napoleon's rise to power, Britain and France, who were now at war in both Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, became increasingly interested in Egypt, Palestine, and Cyprus. This opened up new opportunities for Latins resident in Cyprus. By 1801, according to the information provided by the Reverend E.B. Clark, an English vicar, the British consul in Larnaca was a certain Signor Peristiani, who was also of Venetian origin. Following the abolition of the Republic of Venice by Napoleon, the subjects of Venice who happened to be in Cyprus began offering their services elsewhere, and the British who had warred with Napoleon were especially interested in exploiting the long-standing experience and the connections of Venetians resident in Cyprus. Italians from other parts of Italy also began to settle in Cyprus from the close of the 18th century and throughout the course of the 19th century. The English doctor J. Sibthorpe, who visited Cyprus in 1787, mentions a house of an Italian resident in Larnaca. During his stay in Cyprus in 1806, the Spanish explorer known under the pseudonym Alibay availed himself of the services of an Italian interpreter, a certain Dr. Brunoni, during his visit to the Orthodox Archbishop of Cyprus, observing that this Italian lived after the manner of the Greeks. Notwithstanding the dissolution of the Venetian Republic, as pointed out above, remnants of their community continued to live in Larnaca. When the British officer, Captain Henry Light, visited Larnaca in 1814, he noticed that the descendants of the Venetians there continued to speak the Venetian dialect, quote, though pure Italian is spoken by many of the Franks, end quote, according to his testimony. Captain Light also provides us with the first reference to the existence in Larnaca of the Spanish Austrian consulates. The British diplomat, William Turner, likewise referred to these consuls, the consuls of those two states, in 1815, reserving particular praise for the Spanish consul on account of his steadfast refusal to declare himself to Napoleon. As has been stated above, Spanish Franciscan friars began arriving in Cyprus during the course of the 19th century, and their presence in conjunction with the export of Cypriot wheat to the Iberian Peninsula at the beginning of the 19th century perhaps explains the establishment of a Spanish consulate in Cyprus during this period. One notes here that according to the account of Pouqueville, the French consul in Yanina, in Greece, who sympathized with the Greeks, as Cypriot had been the honorary consul of Spain in Larnaca for 36 years, was put to death by the Turks following the outbreak in 1821 of the Greek War of Independence, something that shows that consular status did not always constitute a guarantee for personal safety. Following the decisive defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 and the annexation of Malta by the British Crown, Maltese and Italians began to settle in Cyprus to an increasing extent. William Turner imparts information on an Italian soldier who had fought Napoleon and who came to Cyprus after his demise, married a Cypriot woman and settled in Nicosia, where he found work as a cabinet maker. Turner also mentions the arrival at the Larnaca harbour of various vessels from Malta. Some years later, in 1837, the English woman Jane Franklin visited Cyprus and in her description of a hostel in Larnaca named Hotel de la Giraffe, pointed out that its owner was a Piedmontese who was, however, French as opposed to Italian speaking. Malcolm Lane, Meeson, the Scotsman who, as mentioned previously, visited Cyprus in 1853, mentions the descendants of Italians and Maltese who had settled in Larnaca, remarking that the Italians and the Maltese always had a liking to Cyprus. He also observed that the Italian was the dominant language at the harbour of Larnaca, and that around 1,000 Greek uniates, that is, Greek Rite Roman Catholics, along with another 3,000 descendants of Italian Maltese immigrants, were resident on Cyprus, making a Latin community of about 4,000. Provided that these figures are reliable, they bespeak an impressive rise in the number of Latins, especially when one takes into account the testimony of the British consul in 1745, a certain Rumlet, that there were only around 1,000 Europeans in Larnaca at the time, while 60 years later, in 1806, the Scotsman Coureas mentioned only 40 families of Latins in the town. According to the account of the German Ludwig Ross, whose work was published in 1853, the Italians arriving in Cyprus were not always disinterested in their motives. A number of them arrived in search of hidden treasure, while a Corsican touring various places in the districts of Limassol and Paphos was in the habit of smashing various stone inscriptions in the hope of finding gold underneath them. Of all the Italians settling in Cyprus during this period, the landowner Riccardo Mattei was undoubtedly the most distinguished. In the years 1867-1868, he discovered a novel method for the extermination of the locust pest that periodically devastated Cyprus, utterly destroying the annual crop. Following his arrival in Cyprus in 1878, Sir Garnet Wolseley, the island's first British governor, attempted without success to rent a house in Larnaca belonging to this Riccardo Mattei. Despite this, the British continued to have a high opinion of Mattei, and in 1879 he was appointed as one of the 4 members of the Legislative Council, along with 1 Greek and 2 Turks. Shortly before his death in 1882, he was declared an officer of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. According to the testimony of Malcolm Lane Meeson, a fair number of Frenchmen and Italians settling in Cyprus took Cypriot wives and busied themselves with commerce or various other professions. He describes them as well off and with money in the bank, but not wealthy, adding that they were extremely careful with their money. He makes particular mention of a Frenchman and his compatriots, who having served at the French consulate decided to remain in Cyprus on account of the lower cost of living on the island. Most of them avoided the pursuit of agriculture and occupied themselves with money lending, usually advancing money to those who bred silkworms for the French market at a yearly rate of interest of 12.5%. One group of Latins that encountered great difficulty settling in Cyprus were the 43 Maltese arriving in early 1880, who were settled on the estate of Putri near Famagusta. The political conditions resulting in their arrival were favourable. Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time of the British annexation of Cyprus in 1878, was worried by the fact that, quote, the Greek kingdom possesses very considerable powers of exciting to revolt Greek subjects of the Porte, end quote. Wishing to dilute the preponderant Greek element in Cyprus by encouraging the settlement there of non-Greek populations, he supported the scheme for settling Maltese on the island. Its main proponent was Sir Adrian Dingley, Crown Advocate to the government of Malta and judicial advisor to Sir Garnet Wolseley, the first British governor of Cyprus, who stressed to the British government that the Maltese would always be loyal to Great Britain, unlike the Greeks. The settlement of Maltese in Cyprus in 1880, however, was unsuccessful on account of the ravages of malaria, which soon reduced the original 43 settlers to 12, who were sent back to Malta. During the period of Ottoman rule, the Latins had been debarred from government posts on account of their Christian religion, for under Ottoman Sharia law, only Muslims could enter public service. This changed when Cyprus came under British administration. According to statistics submitted to the Legislative Council on December 1928, 3 years after Cyprus had been proclaimed a British Crown colony, there were 56 Roman Catholics, i.e. Latins, and Maronites in government service. They formed 3% of the civil service and absorbed 4.2% of its salaries, a discrepancy indicating that they occupied higher postings and salary scales than the other Cypriots in proportion to their numbers. This would explain the strong loyalty that the Latins, along with the Maronites and the Armenians, exhibited towards Great Britain, and their corresponding aversion towards Enosis, the movement for uniting Cyprus to Greece current among the Greeks of Cyprus, who were the majority population. In June 1928, the year marking a half-century of British rule over Cyprus, and on the occasion of the birthday of King George VI of England, the Franciscan brother Basilio Asgaraga, as head of the Roman Catholic mission to Cyprus and leader of the island's Latin community, submitted a memorial to the British governor Sir Ronald Stalls, expressing the Latins' opposition to either union with Greece or autonomy, stating that either option would spell disaster to the non-Greek communities on Cyprus. Similar memorials were submitted at this time by the heads of the island's Turkish, Armenian and Maronite communities. Brother Basilio Asgaraga reiterated the Latin community's position in a memorial of the 10th of September 1929, jointly submitted with the Vicar General of the Maronites, expressing strong opposition to both enosis and autonomy, complete satisfaction with British rule, and stating that greater powers to the Greek majority would mean that, quote, the minorities will suffer terribly, end quote. The leaders of the Turkish and Armenian communities in Cyprus sent similar memorials on the 10th and 12th of September respectively. The Latins in Cyprus, like the Armenians and the Maronites, enjoyed peaceful relations with the Greeks. Hence, Dr. Georgilidis suggests that the fear of Greek rule was perhaps, quote, connected with ancient church rivalries. One notes, however, that the defeat of the Greek army in Turkey in 1922, the Turkish occupation of the Greek-held territories of Smyrna and eastern Thrace, and the resultant mass expulsion of both Greeks and Armenians from Turkey had taken place only 6 years previous to the submission of these memorials. Perhaps the Latins, their Maronite co-religionists, and the Armenians were fearful that Cyprus, without British rule, would suffer the same fate as Smyrna. The Latins and Maronites submitted a third memorial similar in content to the previous two on the 23rd of October 1931 to the District Commissioner of Limassol. The document protested against the Greek petition for enosis submitted to Dr. Drummond Shields, Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, expressing complete satisfaction with British rule. Notwithstanding their differences with the Greeks over the issue of enosis, however, the Latins of Cyprus, like the Armenians and the Maronites, voted by an overwhelming majority to join the Greek community when Cyprus became independent under the terms of a constitution recognizing the existence of two distinct communities on the island, one Greek and other Turkish, namely the Constitution of Zurich, which was ratified in February 1959. We now turn to conclude to the present-day Latin community in Cyprus. Following the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960, the Latin community of the island, along with the Armenian and Maronite communities, was recognized formally as a religious group, with the right to have a representative in the newly founded House of Representatives, as the Cypriot Parliament is called. It should be stressed that these representatives do not represent their respective communities politically, but simply act as a link between the government of the day and their community, promoting its claims and providing for its needs, as well as working with the government in the preservation of the community's customs, traditions, and religion. By virtue of this provision, the Latins and the other religious communities are entitled to vote twice, once to elect their own communal representatives, and a second time to elect members of the House of Representatives who are affiliated to the island's various political parties. The Latins of Cyprus also have a religious leader, the General Vicar of the Latins and Papal Nuncio. He is not a citizen of Cyprus, but a member of the Franciscan order resident in Nicosia and under the jurisdiction of the Latin, i.e. the Roman Catholic Patriarch of Jerusalem. One also notes that the Latins, as well as other religious groups, have their own programs on the state radio. It is a constant objective of the Latin community representatives to increase the number of registered Latins in Cyprus, so as to strengthen the community and thereby ensure that the representative's voice can carry greater weight. In 1991, there were around 290 officially registered Latins on the island who were citizens of Cyprus, but since then, the representatives of the Latin community have come into contact with numerous other Latins, and the number of officially registered Latins has increased to 700. Furthermore, following the completion of a survey accomplished with the assistance of the island's Roman Catholic clergy, it appears that there are 1,700 Roman Catholic citizens of Cyprus and a total Roman Catholic population of over 7,000 permanently resident on the island, inclusive of aliens. If the overseas workers on Cyprus who happen to be Roman Catholic, originating mainly from the Philippines, are added to the above numbers, a figure of over 13,000 Roman Catholics resident on Cyprus is attained. The Latin community of Cyprus has benefited from state assistance for its various schools and churches over the past 10 years, including free health care for Roman Catholic clergy, irrespective of nationality, the payment of the salaries of 5 Roman Catholic priest residents in Nicosia, Larnaca, Limassol and Paphos, an annual grant of 22,000 Cyprus pounds per annum towards the needs of the Roman Catholic Church in Cyprus, fully subsidized education for the children of Latins attending Latin primary and secondary schools, and a partial subsidy for the children of Latins attending private secondary schools. Churches serving the Latin community of Cyprus are that of the Holy Cross near the Paphos Gate in Nicosia, founded in 1900 with a grant from Queen Maria Cristina, the wife of King Alfonso XII of Spain, and that of St. Catherine's in Limassol, founded by the Franciscans in 1872, and that of St. Mary of the Graces, refounded in Larnaca by the Franciscans in 1843. One should also mention an early Latin church founded in Larnaca in 1702, the foundation stone of which had been laid by the French consul, and which had served as his private chapel and as a hospice for pilgrims bound to the Holy Land. An additional school has recently been acquired in Paphos. There are also Latin cemeteries in Nicosia, Larnaca and Paphos, as well as Latin chapels at the College of Terra Santa in Nicosia and the Monastery of San Joseph in Larnaca, founded soon after 1841 by the sisters of this order, who have been mentioned previously. As regards schools, those serving the Latins of Cyprus, but which also accept pupils of other faiths, are the Terra Santa College in Nicosia, founded and maintained by the Franciscan friars, and the School of St. Mary in Limassol, originally founded as a girls' college by the Franciscan Sisters of the Sacred Heart. Both the above schools provide pre-primary, primary, and secondary education, and the School of St. Mary has recently become co-educational. To the above establishments can be added the kindergarten Galochorio in the districts of Paphos. The Latins of Cyprus also maintain 2 charitable organizations, that of St. Anthony in Nicosia and of St. Catherine in Limassol, which organize an annual bazaar every Christmas, with the proceeds going towards the needs of the poor. By way of conclusion, it is possible to state that the Latins of Cyprus form a compact but steadily increasing community, differing markedly from both the Armenians and the Maronites, the other 2 religious groups officially recognized by the Constitution of Cyprus, insofar as, unlike them, they are not nationally homogeneous. The Armenians are Miaphysite Christians, present in Cyprus from Byzantine times. Their community was reinforced during the Lusignan period by migration of Armenians from the medieval Armenian kingdom of Lesser or Cilician Armenia, while the more recently arrived Armenian refugees from Turkey settled in Cyprus after the First World War. The Maronites, monophysite Christians from Lebanon who accepted Roman Catholicism in the 12th century, likewise began settling in Cyprus in the Byzantine period, with significant new waves of settlers arriving throughout the period of Lusignan rule. Compared to these 2 distinct national groups, the present-day Latins of Cyprus differ in that as a community, they began to come into existence during the Ottoman period, that is the late 16th century, and they were from the beginning of mixed national origins. Venetians, French, Italians and Maltese all contributed to the formation of Cyprus' modern Latin community, as did Croatians from Ragusa. They also differ from the Armenians and the Maronites in that their numbers in Cyprus are increasing markedly precisely because of their mixed ethnic makeup, which enables people of different nationalities to join the community by virtue of belonging to the Roman Catholic confession of Christianity. In recent decades, intermarriage between native Cypriots and Roman Catholics of Eastern Europe, such as Poles and Czechs, or even Filipinos from the Far East, has added to this national heterogeneity, and the Latins of Cyprus look set to become not only the most numerous on the island, but also the most diverse ethnically. It may be argued that the ethnic diversity of the Latins and the fact that they came into existence due to the successive settlement on Cyprus of Venetians, French, Italians, Maltese, Ragusans, and more recently people from Eastern Europe and the Far East, make the Latins a community dependent on ongoing immigration from overseas, and that without this they would be absorbed, or would have been absorbed in the past, by the more numerous Greek element. This is not something that happened in the case of the Armenians and the Maronites, but unlike the Latins, both these groups have a strong national identity, reinforcing their religious affiliation. While continued residence in Cyprus and intermarriage with Greeks may result in the partial absorption of the Latin community, they are now probably too numerous to be absorbed completely. Furthermore, as Cyprus becomes a multicultural society to an increasing extent, their absorption will be less feasible and will not even be seen as even desirable. The Latins of Cyprus are religious, not a national grouping, and so cannot be regarded as a threat to either Greeks or Turks, the main national groups on the island. Indeed, their Roman Catholic faith in a European Union, composed mainly, though not overwhelmingly, of Roman Catholic countries, may cause them to be regarded as a valuable link reinforcing Cyprus's present-day European orientation. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for putting up with me for 50 minutes, maybe more. Do we have any questions, any points to be raised? Please.
It was so complete. I don't have any words, any questions.
Well, there must be questions. My talk's never complete. Please.
I have a question.
Yes.
If you should, I'm only here for 4 months on this island.
Yes.
If I should go somewhere and find some archaeological sites of importance, where should I go? Down or?
Well, when you say archaeological sites,
yes,
which period? Well, for the Latins,
yes.
The best place to go, the best Latin monuments are in fact in Famagusta, because there are beautiful Latin churches there, and you also have the Venetian walls and the citadel. So definitely, of course, this is not for the modern period, this is for the medieval period,
yes.
when Cyprus was a Roman Catholic Lusignan kingdom. But the churches and the monuments of Famagusta, including the Venetian loggia, are definitely worth a visit. And also you should see the Latin churches in both the Greek and the Turkish quarters of the Nicosia.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. My question is about the medieval Latin and their existence in the Carenia Mountains. As far as I can see, and I try to recall it, there's not much existence of them in this mountain.
Well, during the medieval period.
Yes, is there anything that...
I'm coming to that.
Yes.
During the medieval period, the Latins on Cyprus were called the Franks. They were Roman Catholics of European origin, mainly from France, Italy, and Spain. And the main areas of residence were Nicosia and Famagusta. You had a few Latins in Limassol. You also had a few Latins in Kyrene, where they had a court, and in Paphos. But it was very much, they were very much centered in Nicosia and Famagusta. But during the Ottoman period, because the Ottomans stormed Nicosia and Famagusta and placed restrictions on Latins there, as I explained in my talk, the town in Cyprus which was most conducive to Latin settlement was Larnaca, because that was where the European ships came to anchor. It developed very rapidly. In fact, it was developing under the Venetians as a center for exporting salt, but it developed even more under the Ottomans, and so that was the main center for the Latins. They had, as we saw in the talk, a presence in Larnaca, a presence in Nicosia, even in Paphos, not in Famagusta, because Christians were not allowed to live in Famagusta. But the main Latin population centers shifted from Nicosia and Famagusta under the Lusignans and Venetians to Larnaca under the Ottomans later on. Please, the lady at the back.
Who's back here?
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. So I wanted to ask, in the mentions of the travelers about the Latin community,
Yes.
And specifically about the clergy, is there any mention of religious plays being put up in the monasteries, like the equivalent of what you would have in, I guess, medieval Europe?
Well, monasteries is a difficult topic because the Franciscans, who were the main religious order in Cyprus, as you know, at least as most Roman Catholics know, the Franciscans are not monks; they're friars, they're mendicants. So they don't have monasteries; they have houses. So most Europeans were put up, and also a lot of Roman Catholic clergy were put up in the Franciscan house in Larnaca. You see, as a mendicant order, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Carmelites are not allowed to own property, but they can have houses which others erect for them. In other words, they can use houses which have been erected by others. So this is what you have on Cyprus in the Ottoman and the early British period. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, the gentleman here. Yeah.
I had a quick question. And at the beginning of your talk, you put that emphasis on Latins from Europe.
Yes.
But at one point, you also talk about affiliation to Roman Catholic Church, including parties like Philippines.
Yes, towards the end of my talk.
And I was wondering, in what respects, the focus should be on kind of the European and geographic area, or is it more affiliation to Roman Catholic Church? I was just wondering about the Faroese situation.
Well, I'm not a Latin myself, but I would say that the main determinant of the Latin's identity is their allegiance to Roman Catholicism. Yeah. But I don't know. Sorry, there was a gentleman there, and then you. Yeah. Sorry, did you have? Sorry, can you please?
Where was the main Armenian center on Cyprus?
Well, the main Armenian center in, I suppose, the Ottoman period would have been Nicosia. Yeah. There are also Armenians in Larnaca, but I would say Nicosia. There was also an Armenian monastery in the Coureas Mountains, but that was for monks. There was no sector presence. Yes, I think there was someone else, a lady. Anyway, I'm sorry. Did you have a question? No. Okay, the gentleman here. Yes.
At the beginning of your talk, when you were saying to Latins, I think you meant Latins by geography, as you said, European Latins, Italian, Greek, French, or Spanish.
Well,
the second part of your talk,
yeah.
when you are saying to Latins, you mean Latins by region.
Well, you see, what happens is this. In the course of time, the Latin community on Cyprus becomes more diversified nationally and geographically, because in the early Ottoman and British period, all the Latins come from Europe, mainly from France, Italy, Spain, and Croatia. But from the second half of the 20th century, in fact from 1970s onwards, you have a lot of Latins coming from the Philippines, and so the Latins become much more diversified because you have, I think, Latins from Sri Lanka, from Ceylon. So what happens is that the Latins in the later part of the 20th century, and of course the 21st century, from being a European community, become, I suppose, an intercontinental or an international community. Yes. Yes, please.
If one looks in Nicosia these days,
yes,
it's you yourself to look quite often.
Yeah.
Where do you find reference or ruins of the existence of the Latin clergy?
Well, for the medieval period, I mean before the medieval period. Well, no, you didn't have any Latins in Cyprus before the medieval period. They started arriving in the early part of Lusignan rule from 1191 onwards. You don't have Latins before the Lusignan period. But for the medieval period, as I said earlier, the main Latin ecclesiastical and even secular remains are in Famagusta, where you have the Venetian walls and a lot of Latin churches built by the Franks, and Nicosia, where you also have Venetian walls and Latin churches. But for the Latin remains, let us say, of the 18th, 19th centuries, you should go to Larnaca, where you have the Church of St. Mary of the Graces. Larnaca has Latin architecture of the Ottoman and early British period. And also, of course, the Paphos Gate has the church, which was built under King Alfonso XII of Spain. And there's a very similar church to that, built in the Maronite village of Cormachiti. But it's the same architect, so one could call it a Latin church. Any more questions, comments? Well, if there's no more questions, no one wants to make a point, thank you very much for listening to me. Σίγουρα άλλαξα, ναι. Ευχαριστούμε. Θα σου το στείλω. Δεν με πειράζει καθόλου. Ξέρεις, δεν πρέπει να θέλω αυτό που θα θέλει. Πάντα θέλω να μάθω το άλλο.
Αγάπη μου, ευχαριστούμε. Γεια σας. Ήθελα να ρωτήσω, τώρα που είστε, που ανέφερες 2 φορές για το ότι δεν εδέχονταν την Ένωση, είχε αυτονομία κλπ. Τι ήταν, πες μου, τι ήταν οι βασικοί τους φόβοι?
Κοίταξε, νομίζω είχα 2 φόβους. Πρώτον, ότι η ελληνική πλειοψηφία θα τους έβαλε σε μια γωνιά. Ο δεύτερος φόβος είναι το εξής. Η Σμύρνη και η Θράκη, εδώθηκαν στην Ελλάδα μετά το τέλος του Πρώτου Παγκοσμίου Πολέμου. Ακολούθησε Ελληνοτουρκικός πόλεμος. Έχασε η Ελλάδα τον πόλεμο και επιάσαν αυτά τα μέρη η Τουρκία. Οπότε σου λέει μετά από την Ένωση μπορεί να γίνει τουρκική εισβολή και να πιάσουν όλη την Κύπρο. Ήδη έπεσαν την μισή, οπότε
Πες μου, το εγγράφαν αυτό?
Δεν το είδα γραμμένο, δεν μπορούσα να ξέρουν τότε, αλλά θα είχαν στον νου τους, διότι ο ελληνικός στρατός χύθηκε στη Σμύρνη το 1922 και σύμφωνα με τη συνθήκη της Λοζάνης η Ελλάδα αναγκάστηκε να παραχωρήσει και τη Σμύρνη και την Ανατολική Θράκη στα ανατολικά του ένθρου στην Τουρκία.
Εγώ σκέφτηκα μήπως επειδή είχαν πιο πολλά προνόμια από τους Εγγλέζους.
Από τους Εγγλέζους δεν νομίζω. Οι Εγγλέζοι είχαν πολλά προνόμια στην Κύπρο, αφού κυβερνούσαν.
Όχι, εννοώ η Laity community.
Δεν ξέρω, αλλά εγώ νομίζω ότι